The last topic that we will discuss when it comes to visualization is calculation of long and forced lines. And I explained already in the introduction that I call this bare trunk because of this theory of calculation by Alexander Kotov, where you are imagining variation that you calculate as sort of a tree, which is growing the longer you calculate the variation. And bare trunk basically means that there is only one forced variation, like a main line, without any branches or very few branches. So the goal here is to calculate and visualize as accurately as possible one variation that may be even more than 10 moves long, depending really on the exact position. But I would say anything that requires calculation beyond 5 moves, so both 5 moves for you and for your opponent, could be qualified as such a variation. And the trick with these long variations is, of course, that the longer it is, the more difficult it is to visualize, obviously, because simply there is more things to take into account. And while some of these high traffic and moving parts calculations were maybe 2, 3, 4 moves long, these could be really up to 10 moves and more. So we will take a look at a few examples here in the video. Later you can of course practice them as quizzes. And we will try to once again solve them without moving any pieces. So sometimes this can get frustrating if you're getting the wrong position in your mind, or it becomes blurry and you can't really follow how the pieces are moving, that you always have to come back to the start and then start again and calculate 10 moves again. But as I explained earlier, this is okay. This is a training course. Basically, we are not competing who will solve it faster or anything like that. The idea is to get the technique right, and then with the gradual practice you will get quicker in this process, and you will of course be more accurate. So let us now take a look at several examples. First, the position that we have on the board. It is white to move. So we have a position without queens. It's very possible that we will get a certain endgame after a few more pieces are traded. And the last move for black was d5, so he had a pawn on d6, trying to get rid of this backward pawn by trading it for white's e-pawn. And he's using basically this knight on b4 as a help, because in case that white takes on d5, then this knight from b4 can take back, and this position would be indeed very good for black. So the question for white is what to do. Of course he can take the pawn, but he has other candidate moves that he must consider. So first of all, there is bishop takes f6, a capture, and another candidate move is an attack, the move a3. And the move a3 makes a lot of sense as well, because we are exactly trying to remove this knight from d4, which is protecting the pawn on d5. So 2 moves to consider. We already established that this is nothing for white. So bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6. This is the first one. Then we can take back on d5. So we can take win a pawn basically. E takes d5. And then the question is, how does black justify this d5 move? He's just lost a pawn. Well, he has a counter tactic. And this tactic is knight takes a2. And after white knight takes on a2, he's using the opened e file. So we have some moving parts here. Rook takes e2. Rook takes e2. and then he got his material back, but also his position is better. So this is a variation that is not good for white. You can see here. Takes, and now knight takes a2, a very important move. And as we see, black is better in the endgame. So we can probably eliminate this line as a candidate, though we of course calculated it. Let's look at the other candidate move, a3. So a tempo, which means that black's pretty much only move is knight d3, another tempo. Otherwise, if he moves the knight somewhere to a6, we're just taking the pawn on d5 and there's no knight a2 anymore. So we can see like this actually, if a3, so we're taking the pawn on d5 and there's no tactics. So now comes a variation that we actually have to calculate and visualize accurately. So a3, knight d3, rook d1, tempo. Now the only move is d takes e4 if he wants to keep the pawn. D takes e4. Now we have another forced move, bishop takes f6, and the idea is that he has to take back, and after that knight takes e4. It's a tempo, it's attack on two pieces, the bishop on f6 and the knight on d3. He can't move the knight obviously because knight takes f6 wins the piece. So basically this looks like white is just winning. But he has one move that we still have to calculate, and this move is rook d8. So it is protecting the knight on d3, and after knight takes f6 check, king g7, his threat is knight f2. Quite an annoying move. So what should white do in that position? Hopefully you can visualize this position very well. If not, again, try to reset and come back and have the right position in your mind. So there is rook on d8, knight on d3. The threat is knight f2, discovered attack and the fork. And white knight is on f6, attacked by the king on g7. And now white has a winning sequence, and this is knight e4. Now knight f2 doesn't work because knight takes f2. So knight from e4 defends that square. And then after the move f5, attacking the knight on e4, white has only one winning move, and this move is knight to c3. And after the knight comes to c3, knight f2 once again doesn't work because rook takes f2, rook takes d1, knight takes d1. And this is our variation. So once again, try to get the whole variation in your mind to practice your visualization of long variations. And here I will show it. We will see how long it is. So everything is forced. Bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, knight takes e4. As we said, two pieces are hanging. Can't protect them both, but he has this attempt at counter tactics. So the threat is knight f2, then f5, and now as we said, knight c3 works perfectly because knight f2 is not possible. The rook is protected on d1. So this was, as I can see here, 9 moves long variation. Not a very difficult one. As we can see, it is a bare trunk, which means that there were no sidelines. Basically, it was all forced. Now, you might argue that in this position after rook d1, black doesn't have to take on e4 because this is losing by force, and you would be right. But it's still it's the most forcing variation, so we have to calculate it first. And then when we see that it works for white or it doesn't work for black, this is great. This is great from white's perspective. So also, if you were black here, let's say like this, and you were trying to decide on a move, you definitely should not play f takes e4. You should calculate that it doesn't work and play another move, maybe knight c5. But the point is that these forcing variations, forcing moves should be calculated first. Knight c5 only comes later. Okay, so this was a nice example for the start. Let's take a look at one example from an endgame, and such variations, such calculations with a bare trunk are very common for endgames. So because there is not many pieces left, and usually the game takes a forcing character, especially once the pawns, passed pawns are involved. And in this position, so we look from black's perspective, the material is equal, but black is the one with the passed pawn on the a file. It is being blocked by the knight. And actually, if white gets his king to c2, it's already going to be a draw, because there is no way that black can improve. So the last chance for black, and the most forcing move in this position anyway, is to sacrifice the bishop on c3 and use the power of the connected pawns, which are usually stronger than the knight in such cases, and try to win like that. So we have to calculate this variation. So bishop takes c3, knight takes c3, b4. And here black has several options. He can move the knight backwards to block the pawns, he can give a check, knight b5, and he can also try to give the piece back, get his king in the square of the a pawn with the move king d3. So there's three things that we have to calculate here. We will see that only one variation is important, only one variation is critical. In others, there will be an easy win for black. So first, let's start with the check. Bishop takes c3, knight takes c3, b4, knight b5 check. Now king goes to c6, obviously, and the knight actually has no good squares. Well, it could go to a7 with the check, then king b7, knight goes to b5, and then we push a2, and that's it. Okay, we're just promoting this pawn. So knight b5 doesn't work, obviously. What about knight coming back? So knight a2, blocking the a pawn, but in that case there is move b3, and now you can see that the knight is really helpless. Without the help of the king, on its own it's helpless against the pawns because black is just pushing the a pawn on the next move. So really the critical variation here to assess the correctness of the bishop sacrifice is the move. So after bishop takes c3, knight takes c3, b4, it's the move king d3 or king d2. And then we have this forced variation where we take on c3, king takes on c3, king c6. So our idea is to sacrifice the a pawn and get our king, the black king, to e3 and then take e and d pawns. So let's see whether this works. So as we said, b takes c3, king takes c3, king c6, king b3, king b5, king takes a3, king c4. Now it's a very convenient detail that the king, white king, is actually being shouldered. A very common motif in the endgame. So the king cannot get to b4. That's crucial here. He has to play king a4 to get to the d5 pawn. So we have black king is on c4, white king is on a4. Black is down a pawn, mind you. So king a4, king d3, king b5, king takes e3. And now d4 pawn is hanging, so the only move for white is king c5, and then king e4 puts white in Zugzwang. And he is losing his d4 pawn and the game as well. So this should be a fairly simple calculation, as a visualization exercise, because really there is not that many pieces on the board to pay attention to. But of course, you have to be able to visualize this. This is probably 10 moves. Let's see. How many moves is this? Okay, here. we are getting our king all the way to c4. And it is a bare trunk. It's a forced variation. Yeah, 9 moves again. So, a forced variation without any branches. If you can see all of this, that's great. Okay, let's take a look at another endgame position. And here we have 2 rooks against rook and 2 pieces. Obviously, with this kind of material balance and extra pawns for black, it should be quite drawish. But here white played the move knight takes f7, and the question for black is, should he take this knight? He is not forced to take it. Of course, he can play a move like king g7. Obviously, even then, the drawing margin is quite big. But let's look at this forced variation first. So I'm going to flip the board now to look at it from black's perspective. Now let's see. King takes f7, bishop c4, rook d8, rook takes d4, king e6. This was all forced. Now white has 2 options. The first one is to simply take the pawn on h4. And after the king moves, bishop takes d5, rook takes d5. White has an extra pawn, but in this kind of endgame, 2 against 1 on the same flank, again, this is most likely going to be a draw. So usually if you want to play for a win, you don't go for such a variation because chances are quite small that you will win. But nevertheless, it is an option for white. What is more interesting though, is that in this position, white can try to win in a pawn endgame. So from black's perspective, this is more dangerous. So let's look at this one more time. King takes f7, bishop c4, rook d8, rook d4, king e6, and now, instead of rook take on h4, white plays the move king f2. So he's not taking on d5 just yet. There is time for that. Let's force black to waste the tempo. So king f2, king e5, rook takes d5, rook takes d5, bishop takes d5, king takes d5, and now white king, since it was on f2, it can go to f3. And actually white has a strong idea here. King f3, he wants to just go king g4 and take this pawn on h4. And unlike the rook endgame, the pawn endgame with the same material is winning for white. And this is the critical position now for black. If white is indeed winning, then the knight on f7 should not be taken. On the other hand, if black can somehow make a draw there, then he might as well take the knight. So let us see now, after king f3, does black have an idea to make a draw? So king e5, king g4, g5, king g4, even worse. There is one idea, move h3. And you have to see this move in advance before you take the knight. The idea is that after g takes h3, white has rook spawns, so this is immediately a draw. If the king gets to the corner, which it can. The other thing is that he can push g3 or g4 in that position. So you need to have the right position in your mind. Let us look at, for instance, the move g4 there. So white has like this, king f3, g4, and h2. Black has king d5, h3, and g6. And that's it. So in that position, it is black to move. And how does he make a draw? He can make a draw with the move g5, king g3, king d4, king takes h3, and now king f3 is a stalemate. In fact, black is stalemating white king. The other way to make a draw is king f4, and after king g2, king takes g4. So that's a draw. Now, if we come back to the position where we pushed h3, white can also play a move g3, and that way he will avoid the stalemate. And his idea is again to go king g4 and pick up the pawn on h3. So g3, very important move. What to do now? So in this case, we have to be a bit more careful. So we should probably play a move like king d4, trying to get our king around to the h2 pawn. Then after king d4, white goes king g4, we go king e3, and here white has two options. He can take the pawn on h3, or he can go after the pawn on g6. Now if he goes after the pawn on g6, this can be very risky for him. King g5, if he goes, our black king is on e3 already, so we go king f2, king takes g6, king g2, g4, king takes h2, g5, king goes to g2, and then even black is the one who's faster. He's promoting his pawn first. So this might even be losing for white. How about in that position? So white king is on g4, pawns are h2 and g3, and black has a king on e3, pawns on h3 and g6. In that position, white can also take the pawn on h3. Now after king takes h3, we go king f3, of course, kind of cornering white king. So white has king h3, h2, g3, black has king f3 and g6. And now white should play king h4. We go king g2, attack his pawn on h2. He plays h3. We go back king f3. So we're keeping contact with his weakest pawn. Before it was the h pawn, now it's the g pawn. So we played king f3. And this will be a draw. After g4, king f4, and again a stalemate. So let's now show this whole long variation, very long variation. Once again, the difficulty might be that it's so long that one can just get lost in this whole calculation, but it's a very simple position. This is just a pawn endgame. There are not that many tactical details here. So let us see this one. King takes f7. The rook is pinned. So these were the forced moves. As I said, bishop takes d5, or let's say first rook takes h4. Let me just show this. White can try to play for a win, but it's most likely to end in a draw. So let's come back here. The critical move is king f2. And now he's trying to win the h pawn with his king. And now h3 is the only way to hold the draw. So this research should be foreseen in advance. And here the most stubborn way to play for win is g3 and king g4. Okay, we analyzed king d4, but probably, no, this is a more accurate move. King e5 is more accurate. I said king d4, but I forgot about this idea. So this might be, shouldering might be stronger. So we will go king e5, king g4, and now we get a very similar position, because one variation that we calculated is this. No, not like this. I dropped my king. So this, and yeah, it's simple to see that black is the first one promoting. So that's really bad for white. He should know. He should not go for that pawn. He should take the h pawn, and now king f3, pushing the king to the corner, then or to the edge of the board, then attacking his weakest link. So now if he goes king g5, we're just taking the pawn on h2 and taking this one on g3. So if he does this, once again, he can't move his king away from the pawns because he will lose both of them. And then if he plays this move, we can, if we want to, we can force a stalemate like this. 14 moves long calculation. So this was probably more challenging. But that's how things are with such variations. You don't have really a choice when you get into such position. And this is why it's important to be able to visualize these long variations. So the conclusion in this position is that yes, black indeed can take the knight on f7. Let's now look at one nice example. I really like this one. It is white to move. And here, this actually happened in a blitz game that I played with white. And it was, I think, a 5-minute game, so I spent maybe a minute or minute and a half trying to figure out a forced variation that leads to an endgame by force. And the difficulty was not so much in seeing the whole forced variation, but assessing whether it's winning or not. So sometimes you will have such doubts, even if you see a forced variation like that. You might not be sure whether to go for it or not. But let's say that here we have more than a minute and a half and it's a tournament game. We can take 5, 10, 15 minutes, however many you need, because this is a critical moment. White is of course slightly better, and he can play a move like bishop e5 to solidify his positional advantage. But a forced move exists in this position, and we have to consider it first. And this forced move is a capture. Bishop takes g7. And the idea here is that he cannot take back with the queen, because after queen takes g7, king takes g7, rook d7 wins a full exchange. So after bishop takes g7, his only move is rook takes d3. Then we take with the rook on d3. And once again, he cannot take the bishop because his rook is hanging. So he has to play rook takes d3. And then the point is that I take back with the e-pawn, attacking his knight. So when he takes my bishop on g7 with his queen, I take queen g7, king g7. The pawn has moved to d3, so d takes e4. And here he has a choice. He can take with the bishop or a pawn. The pawn endgame is probably going to be lost, because he'll have double pawns. And after bishop takes e4, bishop takes e4, f takes e4. I bring my king to e3. He brings his king to e5, but then I'm just pushing my g and h pawns. I'm creating an outside pass pawn, and I will win with the very simple means. So a better move is to take back with the bishop on e4, not with the pawn. So just to make sure that we're on the same page, let's repeat this line from the start. Bishop takes g7, rook takes d3, rook takes d3, black rook takes on d3, e takes d3, queen takes g7, white queen takes on g7, king takes on g7, d takes e4, f takes e4. And now, it is very similar. If I want to win, I need to bring my king to e3. So king f1, king f6, king e2, king e5, king e3. And this is the position. And in fact, this is what I did in that blitz game. Though I didn't see a forced win, I had a feeling this is winning. But if you were, and indeed it is winning, there is a forced win for white there too. But if you had more time, you could also visualize the winning variation even from this very position. So you can see how we are winning the endgame from this position right here. And this is a really nice thing in chess, because you have this power. Once you get good enough in visualization, you have the power to foresee things that are maybe 10 or 15 moves ahead. And as I said, this is one of the things that I really like in chess. So now let us actually get to that endgame. I am not going to force you to find the winning sequence from here. It's going to be a bit tricky. So rook takes d3, rook takes d3. And there is no need really. This is good enough, I think, if you calculate all the way here. So take. Kings go to e3 and e5. Because this must be really good. I mean, chances for white must be really good here. But let's see now. Let's say that black plays some move like c5. Anyway, he doesn't have something too constructive. Let's try to find the winning move in this position. So the idea is somehow to win this pawn. But if we play bishop takes e4, bishop takes e4, and play f4, he's gonna go king f5, g4, king takes g4, and then king takes e4, king h2. I'm not sure if this is winning. Sorry, king h3, king h2. Some counterplay. But there is, if you see this line, there is a way to prevent king f5, and this move is g4. And after that, you can simply take on e4 and play f4. This is really nice. So whatever he does now, I'm taking here, and I'm winning a pawn, and I'm winning the game as well. f4. A really nice motive. Earlier he could have maybe tried to stop it with a move like h5, stopping g4, but it's only temporary. I will still play g4, and I will still do this. So let me see. There is one more idea that we haven't looked at. It's the move king f5, but I believe even in this case we can do this. We can take it, we can play g4. It's king e5, f4 check, king e4, and since our king is much better placed than black king, white is just picking up all the pawns. So that's it. 13 moves from the starting position. So not the easiest calculation, but definitely possible, because it was one forced line, a bare trunk basically. No branches pretty much. Or only one small branch with bishop takes e4. Now let us take a look at one position from a middle game for a change, because all the heavy pieces are on the board, kings are kind of exposed for both sides. But here white has a move that might decide the game if it works, and this move is rook h1, simply playing for checkmate, because if the queen moves, there will be some checkmate on h7 for sure. Now checks like rook g1 or rook g5 are not very constructive, because he can hide his king on h8. So maybe there is no need for such checks. But definitely have to check rook h1 first. It's even a more forcing move than these checks in this position. Now, since queen c3 must be losing, we have to check a move rook takes b3, because it's a check after all. So it's also the first move that white should calculate when he takes rook h1 as the main candidate, because it's opponent's strongest resource. So rook takes b3, a takes b3, queen takes b3, king c1, and now there is a check rook c8. And this might look, at first might look very scary, because white king is the one that's exposed now, and black has a plenty of checks. And this, here we get this moment. I will explain this in the last video in the course, where one has to overcome resistance, if he has one. This basically means that you might be resistant to the idea that in this position white king can or is forced to travel, or is forced to suffer these checks, because there is always a chance that he will either checkmate you or have a perpetual check. So you might, instead of this, you might say, okay, there is rook c8 and I'm not going to calculate this, I'm just going to play king b2 in the starting position, decline the sacrifice, or avoid the sacrifice on b3, and I won't have to calculate too much. So you're using, you're basically going through the path of least resistance, right? You're not forcing yourself to do anything, but sometimes this can be a wrong decision. Sometimes you really have to, if you want to get the most out of the position, you have to force yourself to calculate something that normally you wouldn't. And in this position, since rook h1 has such a great potential to win the game, you need to force yourself to actually calculate this line. Rook h1, rook takes b3, a takes b3, queen takes b3, king c1, rook c8, king d2, and now. There are several checks, but the most important thing is that there is no rook c2 check. Otherwise it would be a checkmate. So the queen on e4 is doing a good job. There is queen b2 check though, so we have to avoid the first rank. We have to go king e3, that's the only move. But still, there is no perpetual or checkmate for black. You can go rook c3 now, check. Our king goes to f4. So now the king is traveling all the way to the other side of the board, and black still has checks. He has queen f2 check. Now we should go king to g5. That's the only move, to hide away from checks on h5 square. And in that position, where black has his queen on f2 and the rook on c3 and we have our king on g5, there are two more checks, or three more checks for black. No, it's even four. Okay, we will count these pawn checks also. So pawn checks like h6 or f6 can be simply answered with king h5. And since the rook is on h1, he has no checks on the h file. And that's it. Out of checks. So we're up a full rook with white. Black has run out of good checks, and white is just winning. The same thing goes for rook g3 check. King can go to h5, and white wins again. So the only sort of dangerous check is queen g3, because now in case of king h5 there is queen g6 check, and this looks like there might be something, at least a perpetual for black. So when he plays queen g3 check, we should go queen g4. That's the only move. Queen g4, the last check h6, and finally king h5, a discover check on black king, queen takes g4, king takes g4, and at the end of the variation, white is up a full rook. And that's it. Again, it's a bare trunk, so you can't really find anything better for black than this. Also, white has forced moves with his king, all the way when he gets to g5. So this is forced. Queen b2 is the best check. Other checks, like queen c3, are even less effective. So, queen b2, check, king goes to f4. We didn't look at queen d2, but it's very similar. In fact, it's even worse, because after king g4 there are no more checks. So queen f2. Now we have to avoid the g4 square because of queen g3. So king goes to g5, and the idea now is that we can interfere after the move queen g3. So rook g3, there is king h5. Queen g3, we can interfere. And after h6 check, I'm not going to take that, but give, as I said, a discover check. And that's it. 10 moves of calculation. The difficulty in this one was that your king was exposed, and this, as I said, might be a psychological barrier in such variations. So here we have seen 5 positions of these long variations, of long calculation. You will get a chance to practice them more in the quiz section. And this basically rounds up our discussion about visualization. Although I will, in the next or the last 2 videos, I will show some examples where we can practice it a bit more. But the topics in the next 2 videos will be different. And we will start in the next video with an interesting type of calculation exercise, which I call simple positions. Basically, these are various types of endgame studies, simple endgames, checkmates in 2 and things like this, which also help with to improve the general level of calculation as well as visualization skill.